Hello and welcome everyone. In this talk, we'll discuss the second contract theorist of this course, John Locke and his Treatise on Government. Last class, we discussed our first contract theorist, Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan. The idea in Hobbes was that since there is no universal morality present in the state of nature, our passions will drift us towards a state in which there is a constant state of war with every man against every man, in absence of a common authority. Only a civil state could lift us out of the state of nature by erecting a sovereign onto which every individual transfers all his powers, and this common authority was preferably a absolute monarchy. That was the argument laid out by Hobbes. Locke will come to a rather different conclusion than his contemporary Hobbes, mainly because his conception of the state of nature varies from that of Hobbes. Even though they were contemporaries, Locke will maintain the position that there are some natural rights present in the state of nature, even in absence of an authority. The argument that Locke develops from this will lead him to advocate a form of parliamentarism rather than an absolute monarchy. So let's start with developing the different ways that both of these authors conceptualized the state of nature. So let's have a look at the Lockean state of nature and then develop his argument from there. The main difference is that for Locke, the state of nature, even when there's no arbiter present, is not an amoral condition. For Locke, the state of nature is a state of perfect equality governed by natural law. A natural law that dictates peace and sociability, and that one ought not to harm another person in their life, liberty, or property. This natural law has its foundation in reason and is discoverable by it. I should mention that this is the secular reading of Locke, otherwise the natural law will be given or created by God and still discoverable by reason, and but also by providence. So, as products of this divine workmanship, we are not to harm each other, according to Locke. This idea is found in chapter 2, section 6. In this, Locke seamlessly weaves together the Stoic tradition and the theological tradition on natural law. And in the end, we'll see that all civil institutions are still bound to observe this natural law. From this morality which is present in the state of nature, the state of nature is not a state of conflict, but rather a state of cooperation. As we'll see in chapter 2, section 6, Locke writes, "So, by the like reason, when his own preservation comes into competition, ought he, as much as he can, preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be done to just an offender, take away or impair the life or what tends to the preservation, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. Yet this duty to preserve ourselves and others also comes with a right to punish the transgressors of the natural law. As said in section 8, in transgression of the law of nature, the offender declares him to live by another rule than the rule of reason and community, and so he becomes dangerous to mankind. The tie which is to secure them from injury and violation, meaning the natural law, being slighted and broken by him. So the person breaking the natural law showed himself to be capable of harming somebody else, and thereby gives away this duty to care for the preservation of humanity. We all become judges and jury and executioner of the transgressor. So the right to punish as a way of deteriorating the breaches of the moral law is held by everyone. Reason for this is that he acts upon a different principle than the one that we are all acting on. So that makes him harmful to all of us, meaning that we all can punish him. This shows that there is no arbitrary power then in the state of nature, because any man can hold over any other man. Because the punishing of these transgressions in the state of nature are not absolute. People can only rightfully punish to the extent, quote, so that as calm reason and conscience dictates, which is proportional to the transgression, which is so much as may serve for the reparation and restraint. So there is an idea about proportionality in this kind of punishment that we are allowed to do when observing the natural law. Any overextension of this would lead to an unjust use of force, and therefore will be just as bad as a person who declared to be living by a different set of rules. Briefly said, even within the state of nature, the punishment needs to fit the crime. Well, we can foresee obvious problems with this, and the state of nature will then also quickly deteriorate into a state of war, because the vast amount of freedom that we have in the state of nature will lead us to abuse it, putting us in the state of war of every man against every man. This then, as in Hobbes, becomes the basic need for a civil government, so the fear of sliding into war. And only in the state of war it becomes something akin to a Hobbesian state of nature. For the description of it reads, "One man may destroy a man who makes war upon him, or has discovered an anonymity in his being, for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion, because such men are not under the ties of a common law of reason, and have no other rule but that of force and violence, and so may be treated as beasts of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy him whenever he falls into their power." So, when the observance of the natural law is abandoned, we deteriorate into beastly beings that may be destroyed. A similar line of reasoning, interestingly, and we'll see how this leads up to the form of limited government that Locke will propose, is that this line of reasoning also holds for holding absolute power over someone. For I have reason to conclude that he would get me into his power without my consent, would use me as he pleased, when he had got me there, and destroy me too, when he had a fancy to it. To be free from such force is the only security for my preservation. So an absolute monarch basically poses the same threat, or somebody keeping you, for instance, as a slave, would pose the same threat as these wild animals would. So Locke continues and states that any case in which one is to employ direct force is a problem. A further example of this can be found in section 18, where he talks about the thief. The general idea here being that the state of nature is governed by laws of reason. Everyone that employs force of any kind is acting upon a different law than that of reason, namely those of violence or force without right to it. And this is what characterizes the state of war. This is an important difference with the Hobbesian state of nature, where for Hobbes the state of nature is by default a state of war of every man against every man. In Locke, the state of nature is governed by rules and reason. Yet in absence of a common authority, the maintenance of this state is delicate. And only when the rules of reason are abandoned, we plunge ourselves into a state of war. So, to avoid this state of war is one great reason for men putting themselves into a society and quitting the state of nature. For where there is authority, a power on earth, from which a relief can be handed by appeal, there is the continuance of a state of war excelled, and the controversies is decided by that power. When reading this, you could ask yourself the question whether Locke just flimsily wallpapered his distinction between the state of nature and state of war over a Hobbesian state of nature, especially since the main interest of entering into civil society, as we just said, is the inconveniences that arise out of being in the state of war, and not something to do with the condition of the state of nature itself. Or is the natural state deeply And if the state of nature is deeply governed by a natural law, we need to discuss whether Locke is a traditional human rights theorist, or in which regard his duties are primary and employs therefore a modern concept of natural rights. And this is not just a thing that is an unsettled scholastic debate about interpretation, because it debates between whether it's actually the divine workmanship that does the work in Locke's line of reasoning for natural rights, or whether it's a more modern, so a naturalistic element of duties and rights in Locke, is important since he was at the foundation of many of our current political understandings. Most well known, the American Constitution. There's a clear link between writers like Jefferson, who were heavily inspired by Locke, and then the Lockean thought. So the argument for the the relevance of this question is kind of deciding whether the argument in favor for the American Constitution was based on a theological or naturalistic element. This is especially interesting if we want to know whether the American Constitution, to some regards, is biased towards religious groups. Right? This has a relevance for public debates on freedom of education, separation of church and state, etc. And this is interesting to pay attention to when reading the second treatise. So whether this natural law you think is really observable by reason, and that's something as a condition of humanity, or whether it all gets its argumentative force from the divine workmanship argument. Now that we've discussed what Locke's state of nature looks like, which is one of natural law linked with the right to self-preservation, and which rules govern it, and how it deteriorates into a state of war, which then provides the basis for civil government, Locke is also famous for something else. Locke is famous for his work on property too, and his account of property is given in chapter 5 of the second treatise. And it's interlocked, no pun intended, with his conception of natural law. So that's why we'll turn towards property now. With regards to property, the state of nature is characterized by communal ownership, or what Karl Marx would have called a form of primitive communism. Locke maintains that something can only become privately owned when one mixes his own labor with it. This argument is found in sections 27 and 28, and it runs as follows. It starts with the assertion that everyone has private property in his own body and person. From that, it flows that he has a kind of private ownership into his own labor and the products which are made by his hands. So that whatever he removes out of the state of nature and lifted up, he has mixed his labor with and joined into something that he has of its own, thereby makes his property. For labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what it's once joined to. At least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. It's labor that puts a distinction here between the privately and the commonly owned. The idea being that labor adds value and that this added value only belongs to the laborer. Again, we can see some similarities with Marx's idea of the labor theory of value. So, for Locke, this is this communal state of ownership in the beginning, in the state of nature, because the earth is given to us for our enjoyment, and therefore it needs to be cultivated. In section 31, he says he, that's God, gave it to us, the state, the earth, the planet, for the industrious and the rational, and labor was to be his title to it, not to the fancy or covetedness of the quarrelsome and contentious. We here already get the idea that the Lockean state will be a commercial state, and hopefully you picked up on the different conception of a state from the ancients. From Plato, property would mostly be held in common in a society. For Aristotle, a specific level of property was simply necessary for having the time and leisure to engage into politics. But a state would never be erected on the principles of commercial protection or the enhancement of a commercial project, where the economy was always subordinate to the polity for the ancients and in medieval time. Locke actually turns this on top of its head, and one of the big elements of the state will be the protection of this property right. But yet, let's take a step back and ask ourselves how unquestionable this idea actually is, that the fruits of one's labor belong to the laborer because the labor is a property of the laborer. Here, it's interesting to look into Nozick's Anarchy, State, Utopia, which is a wonderful book. It can be read as basically second treatise 2.0, but it goes a bit beyond it. And especially the anarchy part, I personally really like. I think it's an amazing logical explanation of an exploration of the idea of a state and draws a lot from Locke. And please read this section besides the mostly just read chapter 6, which is on distributive justice. So Nozick in his book raises some questions. And first of all, it's interesting to look at what is actually the boundary then of mixing one's labor if I want to obtain the object that I mix my labor with. So in order to come to own a piece of land, should I cultivate at all or simply put a fence around it? And if I put a fence around it, what do I come to privately own? The land on which the fence stands or all the land that is enclosed by it? Secondly, why is it that mixing my labor naturally makes it mine as a result? So why do I just not own the added value but also the object that it was added onto? And why is it not the other way around? That when I mix something that's mine with something that is unowned, why do I just not lose something that I previously owned? Why is it the case that I gain what I previously did not own? We can imagine that when I make a tomato soup and pour it into the ocean, does that then mean that I come to own the ocean? Or did I just foolishly waste my tomato soup? Or if I could track the molecules of my tomato soup by some radioactive engineering, would I still own the particles that I poured into it? Or do I really just lose all property right by pouring the tomato soup into that large body of water? So why is my right not just extended to the added value rather than the complete object? For Nozick concludes from this that the strength of the argument made by Locke about why property comes into being is actually not his account of labor adding value, but rather in the Lockean proviso. So let's take a step back and let's focus on that last part of section 27. That I can come to own something when that at least where there is enough and as good left in common. So if the strength comes from that section, then what does that actually mean? Well, in section 28, he defines leaving as good and enough by use, and leaving enough to use for others, which then in section 31 is bound up with the concept of spoilage, so not use or neglect. So it's enrichment which gives title to property. But it also at the same time binds or limits what I can come to own. Remember that the earth was given to us for our enjoyment and ownership over it. Yet, its limitations gets lifted when So let me rephrase. The idea is simply that we've before said that we can own the earth because it was gifted to us. And that meant basically that we had to use and improve it to enhance our enjoyment. Now that's identified with spoilage, the idea tends to be that actually, if it's for our enjoyment, and making it spoil or to not use anything is what limits our property right. So if the right to it comes from the usage and enjoyment, that same notion directly limits what we can have a right to at the same time. If that spoilage is what limits it, and if I get an apple and I let it rot, then my property right diminishes it. So there's a limit to what I can come to own just by a physical boundary. Yet, Locke will argue that this limitation gets lifted with the invention of money, because it allows for stocking value without decay. So as he says, does he who appropriates land to himself by his labor lessen but increase the common stock of mankind for the provisioning serving the support of man, of human life, produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land are, to speak much within compass, 10 times more, and those which are yielded by an acre of land of equal richness, laying waste in common, and therefore that he enclosed the land and has a greater plenty of the conveniences of life from 10 acres than he could have had from 100 acres left to nature, may truly be said to give a 90 acres to mankind. So the idea here is that now we can stack value because there's money. Also productiveness, he will argue, increases the lot that we own in common, because now I make within 10 acres of land what I otherwise, if it lay waste, would have required 100 for. So by cultivation, actually one adds and does not subtract from the common. He even adds in this passage a ratio of 1 to 10, which is a very low one, where in section 37 he will claim that it's actually much nearer to 1 to 100, or increase it in 1,000-fold as suggested in section 43. This idea gets reaffirmed when he says in section 41, a king of a large and fruitful territory, like the Americans for instance, feeds, lodges, and clads worse than a common day laborer in England, which is, of course, a society in which the productive value is a lot higher. So does he then actually suggest that does Locke actually suggest that then there is an unlimited amount that we can come to own? No doubt now that when stacking money, we don't spoil it, and with laboring upon it, we make it more productive. So does that mean that we will always leave as good and enough for others? Well, if we look a bit closer and go back to Nozick, we will find out that there's actually a problem with a common understanding of the Lockean proviso, and we'll delve deeper into that. So let's turn to Nozick to turn out or straighten out our account of the Lockean proviso. The idea behind the proviso seems to be that we can actually keep acquiring products as long as we do not harm others with it. And that was what he tried to undertake with shown productivity, right? That we're not harming others when we are acquiring things through our labor. So what do we actually mean, or what constitutes harm then in the case of acquisition? And Nozick here distinguishes between two forms of harm. One, when I acquire something, you cannot acquire the same object any longer. The second way in which I harm you by acquiring something is that when I acquire something, you are no longer freely able to use an object which was before owned in common, and therefore you were at liberty to use. A strict interpretation of the Lockean proviso would encompass both notions of harm. However, one could not gain any property under this strict notion, as there will be a point in which someone was not able to make an appropriation, as there would no longer be enough left to appropriate for him. This person would then be able to claim to the person who made the acquisition before him, hey, you harmed me, I wanted to acquire a plot of land, but you took the last plot of land, so actually you didn't leave enough for me, or as good for me. Then that second person can go to the person who acquired something for him, and he says, hey, you took up such a bunch of the land that actually, there's also this other guy who wants to have a plot of land that I can't acquire this plot of land. Therefore, your acquisition didn't leave as good and enough for me and that other person. And you can zip this whole argument back until the person who made the first acquisition, because even when there's still a lot left in that, the second to first person in that train will actually walk up to the first person acquiring a small piece of land saying, hey, me and all those other people here, we would also like a plot of land, but it seems that every appropriation you made, all the other appropriations therefore seem to be invalid. So actually, when you appropriate this piece of land, there's not left enough for me and all those other people. So Nozick points out that this is an improbable interpretation of Locke. Not necessarily that it's not what Locke meant, but he says since this argument zips all the way up, it's a logical fallacy to assume that he meant harm in this way and still defended the maintenance of private property. So we need to look at a weaker interpretation of the Lockean proviso, which would only include one of these two concepts of harm. In the previous one, especially the one that I needed to be able to acquire something was the problem. So we'll look in the weaker proviso only at that element which says that what is the problem is that I can no longer freely use an object which I previously could once somebody else appropriates it. And this argument actually does not zip all the way up back to the first initial acquisition. Because as long as there's sufficient left to use, I will always be able to use a plot of land or when we leave some apple trees left, I will always be able to freely pick up some apples or like get some apple seeds for seedlings to put them on my own land, and therefore it doesn't zip all the way back up. So Nozick does not claim that this is how Locke intended his proviso, but that this weak version of the proviso is a more defendable position of it. So Nozick then goes on to claim that any principle of transfer or acquisition of private property must be sensitive to this principle of acquisition as just explained. So in chapter 5, Locke starts with a form of primitive communism in nature, and that everything is owned in common, and then moves to a modest account of acquiring property, right, where the amount which I can own is actually limited by spoilage, introduces money, and another theory, and another amount of rhetorical shifts, and the argument actually ends up being morphed into account of a large-scale ownership with considerable inequalities. So the fact that we consent to a system of money for Locke tends to entail consenting to inequalities because we can stack value now. So why is this account of Locke relative to take note of rather than that it's just a famous account of property? Well, Locke gives property a pride of place which is unparalleled until his writing. So looking beyond chapter 5, we will actually start to call property life, liberty, and estate. So it is important to note this broader interpretation of property as just property that I own, because it starts with my body, right? So it includes my life. If it's my body and therefore my labor, it's what I can and cannot do, and of course the products of it, which is the estate. And we haven't really seen any conception of a state that puts an account of property at its core for the existence of the state up until now. So the naturalness of property and self-ownership will form the core of what comes to be a sober commercial state in Lockean context. So to wrap up again and revise a bit, in the state of nature we're governed by a natural law which entails a right to self-preservation and a natural property right, in which every individual, as we also notice, is judge, jury, and executioner of this natural law. Yet the problem is exactly the fact that every man is judge, jury, and executioner in absence of a common authority, which makes the state of nature an unstable state, right? We might overpunish. This instability is an impairment, actually, to this acquisition of property and the fruits of one's labor, because who wants to labor when the fruits of his labor are actually constantly threatened by a war? Without any enforcement agency, there then is no way that one can prevent or deal with breaches of the peace. So the real need for a civil authority is the need for someone who deals with the disputes and conflicts over these property rights, both in the narrow and broad sense of the word, without falling into war. Or, as said in section 124, the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves together under government is the preservation of their property, to which a state of nature there are things wanting. There is no one prior to Locke who so boldly affirmed this as the purpose of politics. Note how different his drive towards civil association is from that in Hobbes. For Hobbes, it was a condition of absolute fearlessness which drove us into civil society. For Locke, however, he often will use the words inconveniences or uneases or insecurities in regards to property that will drive us towards a civil state. But then once we have this drive, how do we actually erect such a common authority? Well, by giving up your personal right to observe the natural law and transferring this right to a representative. And this is where consent starts to enter the equation. Because Locke will say, men, being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to political power of another without his consent. That is to say, the only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living amongst one another, in a secure enjoyment of their property and a great security against any that are not of it. So when people consent, they agree to lay down their natural liberties for the protection of a civic state, in declaring with a large group of people that you are willing to consent to civic rule, you form a community or a one-body politic, as Locke calls it. This means that the social contract is the formation of the one-body politic, which then becomes an entity with the power to act as one will. Note that we haven't spoken about government yet, because that's the second step, but the social contract forms the one-body politic, which will act with the power of one will. And this will is in this will, the majority expresses what kind of government it wants. So the formation of the original political community is what everybody consents to, and the formation of the government is second to this, and or can be regarded as the first act of the body politic. And what is required for choosing the form of government is merely a majority of the one body politic. So in its choosing the appropriate government, that only the majority is needed, but yet everybody consented to becoming part of this community. Locke is thus not a complete majority rule democrat, as they only have to consent to being willed to govern, and that the majority elects the government means that his account is open-ended. The government doesn't have to be a democracy. The only form of government that Locke seems to absolutely reject is absolute monarchy, for its inconsistency with the account of liberty given, even an account of civic liberty. Because he says, hence it is evident that the absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, think Hobbes, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so cannot form a civil government at all. For the end of civil society being to avoid and remedy these inconveniences, here we have this word again, of the state of nature, which allow for every man's being judged in his own case, by setting up a known authority, to which every one of that society may appeal upon, and any injury received or controversy that may arise, for he, the absolute monarch, being supposed to have all, so the legislative executive power in himself alone, there is no judge to be found and no appeals lie open to anyone who may fairly and independently and with authority decide. The idea being that when one power is absolute, there is no way of addressing violations made by that ruler, or when the ruler is favorable to some parts, still you do not have a kind of fair arbiter in these cases. Meaning that we are not pulled out of state of nature when we enter into an absolute monarchy, but that we are actually at the dominion of an absolute sovereign, meaning that we are just in a state of nature or state of war in submission to this absolute monarch. So this rejection of absolute monarchy raises a question about Locke's notion of consent. Because can people then consent to whatever they want? Well, apparently not. What does it then mean that they are a kind of or does it mean that there are limits and constraints to what one can consent to? So is the notion of consent actually one that has to be rationally informed, and that there are some guiding principles to say what people can and cannot do? So is there a delineation of acceptable consent and unacceptable consent? And that also means, can we keep a majority from ruling as despotically as an absolute monarch would? Well, to answer this, we have to look at how consent is actually conferred for Locke. So this leads to Locke's discussion on explicit and tacit consent, starting with section 119. Explicit consent must surely always bind one to the agreement he made, according to Locke. But what about tacit consent? He writes, how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented and thereby submitted to any kind of government, where he has made no expression at all. Locke's answer is here, and to do this I say, that every man that has any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of a government does thereby give his tacit consent, and is far forth obliged but to obedience to the law of that government during such enjoyments under it. The idea here seems to be that tacit consent can be inferred from owning property that falls within the bounds of the state. Or, for it would be a direct contradiction for anyone to enter into civil society with others for the securing and regulating of property, and yet to oppose his land, whose property is being regulated by the laws of society, to be exempt from the jurisdiction of that government, to which he himself, the proprietor of the land, is a subject. So states are formed for the protection of property, and if you enjoy that protection, that means you're basically agreeing to that state being there and overcoming the inconveniences of nature. When one comes to the state for the benefits of it, that you hold property into it, it seems that you thereby agree ex silentio with what others expressed for you and did, and that you are therefore consenting to the state. Note that there is some friction into this, because Locke doesn't really establish that why this agreeing ex silentio is not necessarily something more than being silent. It just says if you are there and you are silent and you have property, you enjoy the benefits. It's weird of you to want to enjoy these benefits and not want to agree to the government on the question of whether it's a more restricted idea of consent, so one of rational and informed consent over just agreeing to what you want. Well, there is an exclusion of absolute monarchy because it contradicts natural law, but besides from that, there aren't really any kind of qualifications on what you can and cannot consent to, so there is a bit of friction. But then Locke tends to be a slippery fish and occasionally taking with his left hand what he just gave you with his right hand. But at least we have an idea that he agrees to tacit consent, that tacit consent also aligns itself basically with the reasons why we entered into the civil society, and that we first make a one-body politic, and then the first thing that one-body politic does is create or choose which kind of government it wants to have. But the only thing which we can be sure from this idea of consent and the extent to which it's rational is that there has to be some limited notion of sovereignty that one can consent to. We get this from the rejection of absolute monarchy. So an unlimited power of sovereignty does not offer the protection of property, that is life, liberty, and estate, which was the foundation of forming this political community, or the one-body politic. There must thus be a rule of law for Locke, giving effect to a constitutional constraint. Where in Hobbes, of course, we saw that the sovereign just needs to be powerful and prevent risking going back into the anarchical state of nature. The Lockean state is there for the protection of natural liberty and must therefore prevent despotic rule. So let us develop this notion of limited government in Locke a bit further, and Locke's view on the state in more detail. In this, we'll explicitly focus on the different powers which Locke distinguishes, and the extent of their exercise. So to achieve this limited government, there needs to be a form of separation of powers. His understanding of the separation of powers is slightly different from our common day or ordinary understanding of the separation of powers, as that mostly comes from Montesquieu and was made popular in the form of the American Constitution. But the powers that we will address here are the legislative power, the executive power, and then the lesser known ideas of a federative and power and prerogatives. The most important idea here will be that for Locke, there is a primacy of the legislative power over the executive. So as settled and known laws are amongst the benefits which this civil community or social contract gives people, the organization which makes these settled and known laws will be actually the first thing that you erect when entering into a one-body politics. And this body that creates those is exactly the legislative power. So the first decree of the body politics must be the erection of a legislative power. And the purpose of the executive will then just become carrying out what this legislative has decided. So the executive follows the legislative and will prevent citizens, and that following will prevent citizens from being subjected to arbitrary rule. And you'll get this idea in section 153, where Locke states that the executive being both ministerial and subordinate to the legislative. Yet, this account of legislative supremacy is not 100% consistent or 100% watertight. And we'll see this when we look at IR, or international relations in Locke, or the form of federative power, which constitutes the power of war and peace, leagues and alliances, and all in all, the transactions with all persons and communities without the Commonwealth. So for Locke, as for Hobbes, communities stand to each other as individuals would do in the state of nature. Therefore, there is a need of a distinct power in dealing with these other communities. Yet this power is not subjugated to the legislative in the same way that the executive is. Even stronger, it is much less capable to be directed by an antecedent standing positive law than the executive, and so must necessarily be left into the hands of the prudent and wise and be managed in accordance with the public good. So international relations cannot be left to the legislative because these matters require an intervention of what he will in section 166 call godlike princes. Be reminded here of a Machiavellian prophet. The reason for this, or the problem in IR, is that circumstances are there almost impossible to be foreseen, and therefore difficult to protect the common good by priorly arranging for these scenarios by means of positive law, which would be the result of the legislative process. So, as the executive of the federative power is somewhat part of the executive, it is not in all circumstances that the executive is completely ministerial or subordinate to the legislator. And this notion reappears in a section of the book that you didn't have to read, it was like left out in your shortened version, and namely in the discussion of prerogative power, where the idea seems to be that, much like in Machiavelli, that in times of crisis or absolute unforeseen circumstances, the executive must have the power to act upon discretion. As he says in section 159, many things there are which law can by no means provide for, and those must necessarily be left to the discretion of him that is the executive power, in hands to be ordered by him as the public good and the advantage shall require. Nay, this fit the laws themselves should in some cases give way to the executive, or rather to the fundamental law of nature and government, that as much as may be, all members of society are to be preserved. So how does this square with this parliamentary supremacy that we said before? And how is this the case that this prerogative power even does not seem to run against natural law, but be in accordance with it, where absolute monarchy is not? Well, at the core of this prerogative power lies the inability to foresee all circumstances. Right? And that fact makes it necessary to leave some discretionary power to the executive, because the executive needs to be open to act for public safety in the case of these unforeseen circumstances, because this is what actually preserves the liberty in a broad sense. And that is what the natural law dictates. So one example which Locke provides of this is in section 159, where he talks about a fire breaking out in a densely populated city. He says that the executive here should actually have the power to break down the burning house in order to prevent that it spreads to other houses and set the city ablaze. So there's no law telling that in case of a fire you can destroy a house, because that would basically be a violation of the property rights, and the individual is often innocent in the case of a house fire. There might be, after some assessment, and there's no other way to do so, right for the executive to discretionarily say this house needs to be taken down, otherwise the results will be much worse, even if that includes a violation of the property right of that particular individual. It still protects most property in the body as such. So it's clearly still an act directed at the common or public good. So basically, whatever our society does, there must always be a shadow of this natural law into it. And the overcoming of the inconvenience of the state of nature, which are the problems in following or observing the natural law, was why we entered into the social contract or the one-body politics to begin with. So there is room for this prerogatory or discretional power when the legislative cannot deal with specific circumstances, where in all other normal circumstances, the natural law is better safeguarded by a constitutional government in which legislative supremacy is laid down. Yet also here it's not completely clear what the delineation of prerogative power is in Locke, and where it exactly ends. But a study on or a reflection on Locke's prerogative power is very interesting in a modern context, because it deals with any kind of situations in which you can basically, in a state of emergency, transpass the ordinary rights of citizens. And especially now, we see in these corona times, our natural freedoms curbed in the light of a crisis and a pandemic and preventing its spreads. But also, if you think back a bit earlier, we saw an increase in domestic surveillance or domestic spying in the wake of terrorist attacks. And to which extent this is okay or legitimized, you can maybe make an argument for by reflecting on a Lockean prerogative power, especially since, like most of us, is in favor of a limited government to begin with. So now that we are aware of what also the Lockean state looks like and not just its justification, we need to turn to one of the most interesting questions in Locke, and that's basically what to do if the government oversteps its boundaries. Or to rephrase it, when can we unconsent to a government? The first thing that is important to note is that he writes in part 211, he that will with any clearness speak of a dissolution of government ought first to place a distinction between the dissolution of society and the dissolution of government. So again, this two-step process in forming a government or forming the actual state itself is important again when we want to talk about unconsenting. And an interesting element to note here is that, of course, it wasn't possible for Hobbes, but that was because for Hobbes, the state itself was the result of the social contract, where in Locke, the state, or form of government, is actually party to it, right? Because a social contract sets up the one-body politic, and it is then the one-body politic which creates the government. So the government is party to all those rules or intentions by the one-body politic came together in the first place. So, first of all, from this distinction, we get that when society itself gets dissolved, the government must dissolve as well. And this happens for Locke in the case of a foreign conquest. But this will not be our main interest here. But we'll focus on the more influential idea of Locke, which is governments that are dissolved from within. And Locke gives us 3 reasons for the dissolving of the governments from within: an alteration of the legislative power, a government exercising arbitrary power, which is tyranny, or when the government lacks the power to enforce laws. And in all these cases, so change from within or dissolvement from within, the government itself is dissolved, but not the underlying community or the one-body politic. Remember that everyone came together into this contract to get rid of the problems of partiality in the state of nature, and therefore we set up this legislative to make rules and which would be applied and observed in educating a conflict. And this body is the legislative. So when the legislative is changed, which was our first situation, there's basically a different body that creates the rules that we apply when educating conflict, or what we appeal to when there is a conflict. And we wanted to have this body to appeal to not fight over it and go back into the state of war. So when actually the government would change the structure of the legislative, it in that loses the legitimacy, the rules that come from it, that we live our society by, basically lose their legitimacy, and because it's not the body that we can send it to anymore. So that's why if the shape or the formal structure of the legislative is changed, that we can actually redesign the government. So unconsent, and then as a one-body politic, make a new government. The second one, and I think the most famous one, is of course when a government is tyrannical, or it acts contrary to the trust bestowed upon it. And we can find Locke's definition of tyranny in section 199, where he says, so tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to do. And this is the making use of the power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private and separate advantage. And in many ways, this argument links back to the argument outlined before about why the social contract will actually choose a form of limited government and rejects absolute government, absolute monarchy. Then we go back to the last case in which we can unconsent, or like a revolutionary is justified, which is when the government cannot effectively maintain its rule of law. As exactly the rule of law was the reason why one sought to enter a body politic or political society, the community, that is the people who entered in this request, have the right to reshape their government into something that can effectively maintain law and confirms the initial reasons, or observes the initial reasons for entering into the one body politic. The important takeaway of the discussion on all three of these topics is that Locke grounds his right to rebel or to dissolve government into his natural law, which has multiple implications. The first implication is that the community itself can never be resolved by these practices. And the second implication being that the common denominator of all the three reasons that we've just given is that it's actually the behavior of the government which puts people back into a state of nature here, either vis-a-vis one another, so by changing the rules of the game, or vis-a-vis the government itself by ruling arbitrarily. And they are therefore not actually rebelling against authority, so it doesn't seem to be possible to rebel against a legitimate authority or any kind of authority, but you rebel against a not proper observance of the natural law. So you rebel against force and violence, not to rule. And the appropriate political ordering is what you call for. So you call for basically having the right to go back to the drawing table and create a kind of society that will observe the natural law and therefore the proper ordering of the social and political body. However, even in his point on unconsenting, there is a little friction in Locke. Because while he formally grants you the right to dissolve government in a formal way, he will also maintain the position that most men will be practically minded, and therefore do not often exercise this right, unless it's a case of severe extremity. So also the delineation of the right to unconsent, while Locke actually thought of this, is not really clear. The more clear-cut, dissected mention or clinical idea that I just presented you with these four reasons, one, so really reason for consent within, but then the changing of the legislative, acting tyrannical or not effectively maintaining power, actually stems from the, let's say, second life of the idea of Locke's second treatise, which became popularized during the American War of Independence, because they will way more firmly insist upon this right to unconsent or to overthrow or dissolve a government than the feeling that you get from this discussion in Locke itself. So, all in all, let's do some concluding comments because this has been a long discussion. Well, first of all, you'll see that's a complex text with some occasional friction within itself. And Locke is definitely a slippery fish to catch. There are, however, very influential ideas that this text conveys. First of all, we find the first account of a sober commercial state, and one of the most influential accounts, which correlates to that, of how to legitimately acquire property. Second, the government is limited. This is largely due to the difference in the state of nature, of the conceptualization of the state of nature within Hobbes, and namely that for Locke, we are not so antisocial that we need a tyrant to govern us, but that we are also not really good enough that we can do without rule. This also raises a question which I think is interesting, and that is actually to which extent the contract thinking and the state of nature is just a heuristical device of growing out some conclusions which are basically entailed by your assumptions of human nature in the beginning, and whether therefore with a contract line of reasoning you basically just get what you put into it. It is an interesting criticism to reflect upon along the lines of the Dworkin reading we discussed last time when dealing with social contract thinking. And lastly, what we get from Hobbes, Locke, which is a highly influential account, is this idea that we might unconsent, or actually have a right to unconsent. And the interesting part in this is especially that it basically gives the people the right to judge upon the justifiability and the justice and the legitimacy of the person that they're being ruled with, which is not only new for the time period, but it's also in a direct opposition to his contemporary Hobbes, who will say that basically only the sovereign itself can be a judge of justice, and that therefore any act of that the sovereign does is by default just. Locke actually puts the citizenry also in a position to make these decisions on whether a government is acting justly, yes or no. And this is a hugely influential idea. So it's an interesting text, complicated text, but entails a lot of relevant ideas to our current political understanding. Well, I think it's a good time to leave that this has been a very long talk already. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative, and we will see you next time. Bye bye.